just wanna talk about some books. Hey, I just wanna talk about some books. Talk about some books. Talk about some books. Hey, I just wanna talk about some books with you.
Hey everybody, I'm Joe,
And I'm JoJo, and this is Canonical Nonsense.
and we
And
are just two Joe six-packs reading books.
today on the pod, we are still discussing dragon books, and today's book is Guards by Terry Pratchett. Should I be more excited about that? Should be like Guards, because it's like got a bunch of exclamation points in there.
I think fine, yeah.
All right, today's book is Guards by Terry Pratchett. This book is this book is part of Pratchett's Discworld, and it's the first book in the City Watch series. So to start, we should probably discuss what Discworld is, but I don't know what Discworld is, so you
Oh,
should tell everyone.
Discworld is Terry Pratchett's huge series. Actually, I don't know how many books are in Discworld. I meant to look it up. I'm gonna look it up right now.
More than 4, I'm gonna say.
How many books? I think there are like 41. 41, I was right.
Oh my god, we're gonna
Goodness.
have to leave that in then.
Oh, no. Okay. All right. So, Discworld is a world by Terry Pratchett. It's a 41 book series, but each book is partially a standalone. It's just an absurdist parody fantasy world, basically. So, the entire premise of the Discworld is that the world is flat and it's resting on the backs of 4 elephants that are standing on the back of a giant turtle who is flying through space, which is a pretty absurd premise and is quite lovely, I think. And the other parts of the world kind he parodies a lot of different things. He's really looking at different tropes throughout all of his books. Some he focuses on more than others. And this book is specifically based on the guards who die at the beginning of A Tale of the Hero, the guards that come out to fight the hero and that the hero dispatches. So it's focusing on the guards. So this is the first book in his City Watch. So in the beginning of the book, he actually has a dedication where he writes, "They may be called the Palace Guard, the City Guard, or the Patrol. Whatever the name, their purpose in any work of heroic fantasy is identical. It is, round about chapter 3, or 10 minutes into the film, to rush into the room, attack the hero one at a time, and be slaughtered. No one ever asks them if they wanted to. This book is dedicated to those fine men." So he's looking at the trope of the guards in this book, but he also is looking at a ton of other tropes. I think that if you really like Douglas Adams and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you will probably really like Terry Pratchett and his Discworld. I have a few friends who love the Discworld and have read every one of the books multiple times, and they do suggest either starting with the City Watch series or the Witches series, which I actually did read one of the books in the Witches series on a long car ride, and it was also quite lovely. So I think I had an easier time with this book than you did, JoJo. So would you recommend it?
I definitely think that this is a good book. I just think when a book like this plays with tropes, and especially this book plays with expectations in a real way, set stuff up pretty early to knock stuff down, it can be frustrating in some way because it definitely is playing with both what like the reader wants out of a traditional novel and like what a reader expects out of a traditional novel. So a lot of that kind of frustrated me for certain reasons.
Mhm.
And the constant bits kind of also was like frustrating because you're like, in some ways it's like get to the plot, but it's also like, okay, we get it. But
Yeah,
that's a taste thing,
yeah.
100%. So like, do I think this is a great book? Yes. Do I a little bit want to punch this book? Also, yes.
Do you think that if you had a longer timeline to read the book, you would have enjoyed it more?
Oh yeah. Let the listeners know that I super crammed this book in the past 2 days. And if I had time to like put it down and be like, oh, that was a good bit, and then come back to it instead of just like mainlining this book, I think the irrelevant tone would annoy me a whole lot less. So yeah, treat this book, if you find yourself getting frustrated with it, more like an episodic TV show than like a Netflix show that you'll binge in one night. Or maybe you'll love it and you'll binge it in one night. both things are true for different people.
I do think that this book is best enjoyed in small doses, which is strange. So I kind of had the opposite experience with this book as I read or I listened to Witches Abroad. I had a 12-hour car ride, and Witches Abroad was almost exactly that length. So I listened to it all in one day. And I didn't mind it so much as something to listen to in the car because it was so funny and the narrator was just fantastic. And I read Guards with my eyes. And I wonder if I had listened to Guards instead, I would have maybe enjoyed it more because I think that part of what made Witches Abroad more enjoyable was the narrator was just absolutely fantastic. I know I just said that, but I don't think I've ever listened to an audiobook with as good a narrator as Witches Abroad. And I do think I enjoyed it better than Cards, actually. But I think that the problem with that you're talking about with Guards was the same with Witches Abroad, where Terry Pratchett seemed like he was much more interested in the setup and the bit than he was with the actual climax of the book. So it did become a little bit convoluted in the end with trying to tie off all the loose ends, which he basically did, but it just took forever for him to do. And you did get a little exhausted.
There's a lot of really ugly bows on some plot points in Guards, which we'll talk about. Yeah, I actually, in part of binging it and trying to be a person, I ended up listening to, I'd say like 20 to 30 minutes of it while I was reading it. Like I tend to read these books because I can engage with the words better, but it is, I think, probably a book we maybe should have listened to because the performances were quite good in it, and it made me understand better what was happening in the scene when they were acting it out than when I was just reading it. Like, I listened to spoilers. I listened to a scene where someone's like notching a bow. Spoilers for a podcast where we have a ton of spoilers. So spoilers for later in the podcast.
Maybe this is a good time to remind everyone that we don't care about spoilers, and we are going to tell you everything that happens in this book. So if you don't like it and you want to read this book and you don't want to be surprised, I would say turn this podcast off, go read this book, and then come back when you're ready, and we will wait for you. And I do think that it would be worth it if you're interested in reading this book to go do that.
Yeah, I think it's a book that's like going to be kind of resistant to spoilers because the best part of the bits and you just got to read them.
Yeah, this book was maybe one of the funniest books I have read in recent memory. And the only reason I say it's not the funniest book I've read in recent memory is because I think Witches Abroad was funnier.
Oh.
Yeah. And there is absolutely no way that we could explain or tell the jokes in this book in a way that they will be funny at all because of the way he writes them. So
I do have a couple quotes that I'll read, but yeah. So anyway, when I was listening to the audiobook, someone's notching a bow that they're about to shoot, and they're like having a conversation during it. So like one person is like, "Oh, I'm holding a bow really hard," and then other people are having regular conversations, and that sounds so much better than having like than reading he grunted, he grunted, he grunted like 3 lines in a row.
I'm actively amazed. I kind of looked it up, so maybe if I'm wrong, you viewers, you can correct me, but I'm really astonished that this hasn't been made into a TV show, just the Discworld. I know that there's a Guard series on BBC, or there was, but apparently the person who made it hadn't even read the books. So it
Oh,
was
the
met with a lot of
classic sci-fi trope of someone taking the title and slapping it on whatever P they want.
but it just astonishes me that this hasn't been made. It would be such an easy thing to make a show out of it. It has the potential to just because it feels like you're reading a play. When you're reading it, it just begs to be performed because a lot of it is about the way that people are talking to each other and having conversations when something's happening over there, which I think was another thing that bothered you, JoJo, but we'll get into that.
We'll super get into it. I was reading through my notes and it's just me getting steadily more angry.
So yeah, there is a whole bit that is running through the book where the one character keeps getting into these fights and they're all off screen, and it's purposeful and intentional. The author's doing that,
Let's just
intentionally.
start let's
Oh
just
yeah,
start talking about the book. Let's just get into it.
okay, so I do just want to say before we start that this book was absolutely packed full of really, really short scenes that had information in them that was important later on. So when JoJo and I were talking about this earlier, JoJo did mention that Terry Pratchett is very good at foreshadowing. And he does so in a way that brings a lot of humor to the book. So this is going to be kind of a long summary. I have to warn everybody before I begin. So the book does start with our main character, whose name is Captain Vimes, and he is the head of the City Watch. And he's drunk in a gutter in the city of Ankh-Morpork, which is a city that makes an appearance in multiple Discworld books. It's not a beautiful city. It is pretty disgusting. And we kind of get the feeling that this book is a little bit making fun of the gritty noir detective trope.
It's definitely playing with that trope because Vimes is much more of a detective than he is a character in a traditional fantasy novel.
Yeah. Then it immediately moves to another character, the librarian. And the librarian was once human, but he was turned into an orangutan. And he is going to sleep in his library in a pile, like a pile that would be the kind of resting place an orangutan would sleep in, as someone comes into the library with the intent to steal a book. So the librarian doesn't see him come in. This person steals a book and takes it to a secret society meeting of the Elucidated Brotherhood. There's this like whole long bit where the person accidentally goes to the wrong secret society door and knocks and gives the wrong password, and then
But they're largely identical passwords, and it's largely identical people in robes.
yeah, there's one word different. And so we, immediately are shown like there's literally nothing in this book that will be serious. And then so he finally does get into the correct meeting, and there are basically various blue collar workers. There's a plasterer, one is a thief, but they're all hidden behind shrouds, and all of them are complaining about the state of the world. These complaints are mostly about how they're oppressed because other people have things that they do not or have inconvenienced them in some way. So one of the people mentions that his relative has a new carriage and he is hateful of him for having this new carriage. The other is very frustrated about this woman who owns a vegetable shop, though we're not sure exactly why he's upset with her, but it seems that they're just frustrated that other people exist and have lives surrounding them. So they're saying, I'm oppressed because of this. I'm oppressed because of this. Very much like the meetings in Parks and Rec, where they're trying to, if any of you have seen Parks and Rec, when Leslie gets recalled, they're talking about how she took away their freedom. It's exactly like that. And it's very funny. And you kind of get this feeling that you have met these people where they just feel like the world has beaten them down for no reason.
They're intentionally portrayed as like very spiteful and unpleasant
Yeah.
people. All of these people are sort of like kind of the Dolores Umbridges of the world. None of them are, he who must not be named, like the evilest of evil. They're all just like the petty kind of evil that like everybody knows and exists in the world and is like somehow worse than
I don't think they're as effective though as Dolores Umbridge. I think that the Supreme Grand Master is kind of a Dolores Umbridge, but I think that the others are like that kid that you know in class who thinks that his life is worse because I don't know, pick your bigoted viewpoint that doesn't really affect anyone except the people involved.
Anyway, those are our villains in the story.
These are our villains. So the leader, the Supreme Grand Master, is able to kind of shepherd them into coming up with this plan to bring back the king of Ankh-Morpork, which hasn't had a king in a very long time. And they decide to do it by having someone slay a dragon. And then we cut away. So one of our other main characters is introduced. His name is Carrot, and he is a human who was raised by dwarves. And his his adoptive parents, decide to send him to Ankh-Morpork to join the City Watch after they have a discussion with another human friend who thinks and believes that the City Watch is still a really coveted position.
Can I interrupt you super quick?
Sure.
Sure. I just want to state, because this bothered me the entire book, that the Supreme Grand Master goes on this spiel about how they're going to use the trope of the returning king to like basically seize power and have a fake king, and then he talks about how, like, in the tropes, a king comes back from like the middle of nowhere with no ties and a special sword, and then like goes and defeats the dragon, and then it smash cuts to Carrot, and we learn about his upbringing as so he's like raised as a dwarf, and then he's like, I thought I was a dwarf. Mom's a dwarf, dad's a dwarf, and then mom and dad are like, actually, your adopted son. We found you in a pile of dead bodies in a raid, and they're like, and he's like,
Yeah.
oh, okay.
Well, and the only thing they found with him was an old sword that is not magical and is described literally as not special in any way. It
Yeah,
has
yeah,
no
yeah.
jewels on it. It's not magical. It's just really old. And so he does have this special sword, and it's described as being significant and like unique because it's not magical or pretty at all. That it does set it apart from other swords. So we know right away that Carrot is probably the lost bloodline of the king. However, I did, because I looked it up after I finished the book because I wanted to know if Carrot ever does ascend, and apparently he like recognizes it throughout the series, but he never ever fully acknowledges it.
Yeah, anyway, so I bring it up because it's actually not important at all to the story. It's just a thing that like bothered me throughout the book, where they're like, obviously he's the king, you could come back and slay the dragon, but doesn't happen, doesn't matter, doesn't come up. Anyway,
But
keep
this
going.
book is about the subversion of tropes and looking at tropes. And part of what Discworld is a book where it's a series where the characters are even aware of tropes. And there are multiple scenes in this book where the characters, because they're aware of a trope, they actually discuss it and they talk about whether or not the trope will kind of snap into existence because of their actions. So in some ways, I think that you're more critical of this than I am. I found it kind of delightful. But anyway, he was raised by dwarves and does believe he is one. Throughout the book, he slowly realizes that he is absolutely not a dwarf. He's huge, for one. He's like above 6 feet. And so they send him to live with the humans for a while because they think it will be good for him. So let's talk about the dwarves for a moment. The dwarves do not understand any kind of turn of phrase. So there's a whole scene where the dwarf king is talking to a human, and the human says the phrase and Bob's your uncle. And then there's this entire conversation surrounding, well, no, my uncle is actually this person. And the guy's trying to explain to him that no, it's just a turn of phrase. And he doesn't understand what that means. So that will become really important later in the book. But basically, throughout the whole book, Carrot does not understand any kind of turns of phrases. The dwarves are pretty straightforward people. They're pretty stoic. They don't act out of line. They're hard workers, which also becomes a plot point later in the book.
Yeah, I mean, just a bait like Carrot's your basic average hero. He's 6'5". He's built like a brick stuff house. As he goes to like the 500-mile trek to the city, he's there's a description that's quite funny about him like largely going unmolested because people keep like jumping out from behind trees and then like
Yeah.
seeing him and being like, oh, sorry, good day.
Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, so he does visit the human friend before he goes to the city, and the human friend gives him a law book that describes all of the laws in Ankh-Morpork, which slowly we learn throughout the book that none of these laws are still in effect. And he also gives him a codpiece, which is also a running bit throughout the book. And Carrot actually does not know what sex is. He's pretty sexless because dwarves are just pretty closed off about that kind of thing. So that's also another joke throughout the book. All right, the Elucidated Brotherhood meets again and is able to summon the dragon through a spell in the stolen book. To do this, they have to bring some magical items because they have to use magic to summon the dragon. And this does summon the dragon long enough to kill a thief. Where we see Death, and Death is a character who appears in, I think, all of the Discworld books. He's pretty kind of a lovely character, but we don't see him for very long in this book. But he only is able to be summoned for so long, the dragon, not Death. And the society realizes that they do need better magical items, so they go to gather more. While they do this, Carrot arrives in the city and he writes home. And this is something that he does throughout the book. He writes home and he sends his family his wages. So he tells his dad that he met a woman and he saved her from being robbed. and was successful because of the codpiece. The guy tried to kick him in the groin, and it didn't work because he was wearing what he calls a protective. And this is, again, a running bit throughout the book where people keep trying to kick him in the groin. And because he's wearing this codpiece, he's unaffected by it. So she takes him with her to, and she is a sex worker, and she takes him with him to, or takes her with him to her brothel where he stays for a few days. And he's so surprised as he goes with her to see what's called a thieves guild and decides to do something about it. So we next meet the patrician, who is the leader of Ankh-Morpork. And he is a really interesting character. Do you want to talk about the patrician?
Sure. The patrician, I like the patrician, though I have some qualms with his character. Basically, he is portrayed as like a realist and like an incredible tactician who rules not because of any slovenliness or like greed or any other characters you would expect in like
Or excess. Yeah.
yeah, or some sort of correct ruler, but just because like he's so good at it, it's like the one thing he does very well and he's very good at it. He like understands a lot about human nature and how different groups move and like work between each other and is able to sort of manipulate them, and you sort of see it in the way the city's set up, and you explicitly see it in the way that he interacts with the thieves guild, because the head of the thief guild walks in and he has turned them from like a clandestine organization to basically not just like a guild, like one of the more accepted and well flourishing guilds in the city, so that like basically a patron of him.
Yeah, they have all of these regulations on who they can steal from, how much they can steal. So they have quotas and things. And it does keep the city safer than it would have kept if there was no control over them. So he rules the city in a crooked way because it's such a crooked city that it would be very difficult to clean it up entirely. I actually have a quote from when he created the Thieves Guild, and they thought like, the thieves kind of thought that they had the run of the city, but then he called them back, and it said, "A little while later, the patrician summoned the leading thieves again and said, 'Oh, by the way, there is something else. What was it? Oh, yes. I know who you are,' he said. 'I know where you live. I know what kind of horse you ride. I know where your wife has her hair done. I know where your lovely children, how old are they now? My, doesn't time fly? I know where they play. So don't you forget about what we agreed.' And he smiled. So they did, after a fashion. So he's able to kind of control them through various means that are nefarious. I really liked him as a character. I kind of wish we had more of him. I wonder how much he appears in other books in this series.
Yeah, it's very funny that he's being overthrown because he seems like quite a competent leader,
Mm-hmm.
because he's so competent and you relate to, and you're like, "Ah, he seems pretty good." It makes the people overthrowing him seem more like villains, even though he does preside over like a very corrupt society.
He is a villain in some ways. He doesn't try to clean up the city. He just works within its own corruption.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also. Now I'm gonna hold this thought until later. I was gonna talk about the citizens, but I really think you see the citizens later in the book.
Okay. We meet him because the head of the Thieves Guild is complaining because he was arrested by the Night's Watch. And we hear through him that Carrot came into the Thieves Guild and arrested him and cited all of these laws, none of which any of them knew what they were because these laws aren't in effect anymore, and carried him to the palace and dropped him off. And the patrician says he'll take care of it, but he is more perplexed and amused by this. And we also learn here that the creation of the Thieves Guild, and probably the Assassin's Guild too, is connected to the decline of the Night's Watch. So another thing that we keep hearing over and over again when Carrot's like, "Oh, I'm joining the Night's Watch, is people keep asking him like, "Well, what did you do to deserve that?" Because they think he is forced to join it as a punishment and not because he thinks it's a noble pursuit. So we learn that the Night's Watch is really disrespected throughout the city. It has no real power. So Vimes meets with the patrician's assistant, whose name is Lupine Wants, to discuss Carrot. And we learn quickly that Vimes doesn't like Wants. They knew each other when they were young. And Wants was not the leader of any of the street gangs, but he was pretty much the one who was able to kind of whisper in the ear of the leaders of the street gangs. Vimes doesn't trust him. How quickly did you figure out that Wants was the Grandmaster of the secret society?
To be honest, I kind of missed him in the beginning. I like missed him in this scene. So when he shows back up later, I noticed him and I'm like, oh yeah, but just I like didn't clock it just because I missed this part.
Okay, because I I as soon as he was introduced and we got that whole backstory about Vimes knowing him as a child, I was like, okay, he's the leader of this group.
This is not a subtle book.
No.
If you got a vibe, that vibe is right.
It's probably right, again, because this book is using tropes. So it's using our knowledge of these kind of archetypes and tropes to its advantage to help it tell a story or subvert those tropes and archetypes. Vimes leaves for the Night's Watch headquarters and we meet Sergeant Colon, which is spelled like a colon. And Colon is like a very large man. He was once a military man. And the two of them leave. We see one of the brothers of the elucidated brotherhood stealing a magical sign that's malfunctioning, but they think that he's just trying to fix it, and he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm trying to fix it." It shows kind of how poor their skills are at finding and detecting crime.
It's also a running gag of, and you see this throughout the book, of like a lot of people being like, I don't really want to guard this because that would create conflict and then I could maybe get hurt and I don't want that to happen.
Yeah,
So I'm just going to kind of look the other way and keep moving. Or like, I'm going to help, but as slowly as possible.
yeah. There are a lot of descriptions of guards running really slowly towards something because they don't want to be the first to actually get there. And we also see this a little bit in the next scene because we meet Nabi, who's another member of the Night's Watch, and he's showing Carrot how to do his job badly. So he's saying, "Oh, at each hour you want to ring the bell and say that all is well." And Carrot says, "Well, what if all's not well?" And he says, "No, no, no, just say that all is well." And then he also tells Carrot they're trying all of these doorknobs of these closed shops to see if any of them are open, and Carrot's asking him, "Well, why are we doing this?" And he's like, "Oh, just to make sure that they're locked." And Carrot does catch on, and he is able to open one, but he pretends that it's locked because he realizes that Nabi is actually trying to steal from these places. And Nabi is described as literally as average as you come. So he's that person that you really don't notice because he looks like everyone else. And I think we all do know people like that. And that's one of the things that I think Pratchett is really good at. He is very, very good at describing characters that are completely absurd, and yet you kind of feel like, yeah, I know that person. I have experienced that kind of person in my real life, not just in another book as a trope or archetypal character. His characters do feel like they exist.
Yeah, Terry Pratchett has a wonderful grasp on the banal absurdity of everyday people.
Yeah.
He's like, this is so weird, but so are people.
Yeah. And then, yeah, like the way that he constructs a plot is that the characters in this book specifically, I can't speak for all of his books, are basically just also kind of experiencing the absurdity of their world. And they're pretty passive when it comes to plot. They aren't doing things that are forcing plot to happen. Plot is happening and they're responding to it, which I think works well because another character's absurdity is forcing them to respond instead of them having a lot of impetus to do things. So Nabi and Carrot pass a dwarf bar where a fight is breaking out. Carrot is able to de-escalate the fight just by guilting them because, again, in their mountains, the dwarves are very calm people, but when they are in the city, they become more riled. They drink more, they fight more. So Carrot basically says, he's like sings a song to them and he reminds them of their dwarf mothers and they all start crying and he's able to get them to stop. And Nabi the whole time is telling them, like, just don't even engage. Just don't engage. So then they enter a bar, and Carrot tries to arrest a different bar. And Carrot tries to arrest the bartender for breaking the city ordinance of serving alcohol after a certain time. And this starts a bar fight. The orangutan librarian is also in the bar at this time, and he scoots away because he doesn't want to be a part of whatever is happening in the bar. But again, this is another fight that Carrot is in, and we don't actually see it because Nabi is outside with the other watchmen, and they're waiting outside the bar, basically for Carrot to get the shit kicked out of him, and then they're surprised when he does in fact win the fight.
Pretty much at this point, it's very clear that Pratchett is trying to subvert the heroicism in any part of the story, and he tends to do that by not showing us fight scenes, which I think like really works in the story. But I don't know if I've said it before, but a huge pet peeve of mine is when they don't show fight scenes, because a lot of times you get it from writers who can't write them. So like a lot of the stuff that's like important happens off screen, and then you're like, anyway, that happened and it was important, but we can't show it to you because the writing's not good enough. I don't think that's what's happening here, but it is a pet
No.
peeve, and it's a little bit why I'm grumpy right now.
Yeah, do you want to share where that started?
Oh, it started in Twilight. I read the Twilight books when I was like 11 or 12, and I was just like, and anytime anything exciting happens, Bella freaking faints and then wakes up, and Edward's like, oh man, that was such a crazy fight. And I'm just like, no, put it on screen.
So this is a long grudge that JoJo has had with writers. So we'll probably see this a lot in this podcast.
Once again, think it's the right choice for the book. I'm just going to be
Mhm.
grumpy about it.
Yeah. So Carrot defeats the final challenger, which is a troll bouncer, and the Watchmen then decide, okay, we can assist him now. And Nabi does try to rob some of the people in the bar who are passed out because Carrot was able to single-handedly defeat all of them. So we know that these characters, and Vimes just gives him a light scolding. He's like, well, we'll let all of these people off with a warning. We're not going to arrest them. While they're doing this, the secret society summons the dragon again, and it kills a bunch of ruffians who actually were following the Night Watch, who got drunk after that encounter. And the patrician does come to see the damage done by the dragon, but they kind of say, oh no, this is not possible. We think the footprints are from a large wading bird. And this is a bit that continues throughout the book, where they keep mentioning this mythic large wading bird. But we also do see Vimes kind of his detective skills are awakening, and he realizes that there's no way that a dragon could have flown down into the alleyway where these people were killed. It had to have just appeared there because there are all these clotheslines. The footprints appear and disappear in such a way where the dragon wouldn't have been able to lift off or land without knocking down all of the things that are hanging between the alleyway. He doesn't really know why or how. So Vimes goes to visit a woman named Lady Ramkin who breeds swamp dragons. And Lady Ramkin is just fantastic. She's
perfect.
just wonderful. So she's basically described, he comes to her door. She's a very wealthy woman. He comes to her door, and she's described as like this giant proto woman. She's described kind of like a Valkyrie. She's huge. She's wearing this big wig because if you raise dragons, you can't have long hair because they'll burn them off. And she basically is like a fancy dog breeder.
She's not just rich, she comes from such a level of nobility, like so far back, that she's immune to a lot of like the class and like gender roles that are sort of ascribed to her, which is like really an interesting thought.
Yeah, she's super eccentric. She's like eccentric. She's like kind of any of the characters in Pushing Daisies. She kind of reminded me of. I haven't watched Pushing Daisies in years and years, but there was a brightness to her that really reminded me of the ants in Pushing Daisy.
She reminded me of Best in Show, but it's
Yeah.
been like 10 years since I watched it, so I don't want to make a reference, but definitely a very silly sort of dog breeder type.
Yeah, and speaking of her, her own pedigree of being in the wealthy class for generations, there are a lot of descriptors when she's trying to command a group of people or a room. it's described as all of her ancestry coming forth because she's just been raised to have authority, that it comes really naturally to her, that she can just pull that out without even thinking about it, without trying. So he comes in and they discuss dragons, and swamp dragons are basically a kind of dragon that is quite tiny. They're a lot like dogs, but they're kind of disgusting and horrifying in a way that's just kind of amazing. So he's sitting at the table and there's this old dragon putting its little head on his knee, but it's saliva, its drool is so acidy that it's burning a hole in his pants, and he's just thinking, I just have to allow this to happen. I can't react to this. And it's not being aggressive or anything. It's just doing what a dog would do, and it's so funny.
Yeah, the swamp dragons are, from what I understand, they seem like larger lizards with just like incredibly complex digestive systems. I think they're described as having like 4 stomachs as one point.
Yeah, and they can rearrange their digestive system too.
Yeah, they can be crazy and have the ability to eat anything, which will come up later, as all things do. So they have the ability to eat anything and then process it down to sort of make fire, but also they have a tendency to explode, which does not happen on screen, but is talked about multiple times. And then sometimes when they fight each other, they'll like fight it. They just seem like mini weird farty bombs.
Yeah, and they're really described. So we learn a lot throughout the book of the anatomy and evolution of the swamp dragon. And they really are described as a creature that was an evolutionary misfire. It should not exist, but it does precariously. And there's no way that we can describe, or even if we were to just read the descriptions, that they would be funny. But they're hilarious. Every time the digestive sounds of the dragons are described, they're so funny. It's like described as pipes gurgling, just these horrible sounds coming from this kind of small creature that kind of is very pitiable in many ways. So Lady Ramkin does show Vimes all of her dragons that she is breeding, and they all have ridiculous names, and including this one that's obviously extremely inbred. It looks horrifying. It has this really pudgy nose. Its wings are really small, and she says that she's probably going to have to cull it because it can't breed, because they breed in the air. They have to be flying, and she's not sure that he can fly. While this is happening, Carrot meets the librarian and they go to investigate this stolen book. And the librarian can't actually talk, so they literally have to play a game of charades to speak to one another. The librarian can understand Carrot, but Carrot, the only thing the librarian can say is ook and eek. He is literally playing a game of charades. And it's a bit that maybe goes on a little bit long, an example of one of those. But they go to investigate. While they're doing this, the dragon reappears. Vimes and Lady Ramkin watch the dragon breathe fire from where her mansion is outside of the city. And it's flying over the city, it's breathing fire on the city. And Lady Ramkin is very impressed. She's very excited by this dragon. And Vimes is like, oh my gosh, the city is going to be destroyed. But later he discovers that all that was destroyed was a carriage house and a vegetable shop. He writes with pinpoint accuracy in his notebook. And he's really confused why these were the only 2 things that were destroyed. But if we remember, those were 2 of the things that the Elucidated Brotherhood were complaining about. So they're extremely petty with the use of this magical dragon that they are summoning.
I was going to say, it's also a beautiful example of Vimes getting the 100% right answer and then completely trying to ignore the fact that he got it because it means that he'd have to like follow it up, which is a good bit.
Yeah, but he is kind of falling into heroism in a way that's quite funny. He's like, I really don't want to do this, but I have to.
Yeah, kicking and screaming all the way into being a hero.
Yeah. Oh, I do have a quote. I don't know if you want me to read it about the dragons eating.
Do it.
All right. So when Lady Ramkin is describing dragons, she says, I'm afraid they're not very well designed creatures, dragons. They would never have survived at all, except that their home swamps were isolated and short of predators. Not that a dragon made good eating anyway, once you'd taken away the leathery skin and the enormous flight muscles. What was left must have been like biting into a badly run chemical factory. No wonder dragons were always ill. They relied on permanent stomach trouble for supplies of fuel. Most of their brain power was taken up with controlling the complexities of their digestion, which could distill flame producing fuels from the most unlikely ingredients. They could even rearrange their internal plumbing overnight to deal with difficult processes. They lived on a chemical knife's edge the whole time. Once one misplaced hiccup and they were geography. When it came to nesting sites, the females had all the common sense of mothering and instinct of a brick, which is like a pigeon. But anyway, so that's kind of how these dragons are described. In response to this dragon, the patrician posts a $50,000 reward, and it attracts a bunch of monster hunters, but when they're looking at the sign, they're very uninterested because they feel that that's not a good enough price. And basically, we are listening to a conversation of them where they're talking about how they think they deserve half the kingdom and the patrician's daughter. But the patrician doesn't have a daughter, so then there's a conversation about his aunt. Then there's a conversation about the patrician's dog and whether that dog is good enough as a reward. But none of them are interested in risking their lives for such a measly reward. And again, we get into that trope of if you save a city from a dragon, you are owed a princess.
So this is the best bit in the entire book. I'm gonna best bit in the
Yeah.
book, putting it down. Yeah.
It's very funny. So because none of the monster hunters are interested, the patrician asks Vimes to find the dragon's lair. Basically because the patrician thinks that he can negotiate with it and come to a fair accord, which is very funny that the patrician's like, it's a monster, but I'm good at negotiating. This is what I do. So I can do that. The Night's Watch waits for it on the roof of their building, and everyone is actually waiting on the roofs of their buildings to catch a glimpse of this dragon later that night. And there is a very, very funny scene where everyone is just shooting at anything that they can see. So a flock of bats, a cloud, the moon, and they're actually they are hitting other people with their arrows. And this whole time, Colin is like, please let me try to shoot the dragon. Please let me try to shoot the dragon. And Vimes is saying, no, 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 no. You can't do it. We have to find out where its lair is. We have to bring it to the patrician. When the dragon comes, it actually does destroy their headquarters, but Carrot is able to save them because he pulls them all off the building as the dragon hits it. And we do get a really lovely description of this dragon, which is very different from the swamp dragons. So the dragon, was peering down interestingly over the gutter. Its face alone was taller than a man. Its eyes were the size of very large eyes, colored in smoldering red, and filled with an intelligence that had nothing to do with human beings. It was far older, for one thing. It was intelligence that had already been long basted in guile and marinated in cunning by the time a group of almost monkeys were wondering whether standing on two legs was a good career move. It wasn't an intelligence that had any truck with or even understood the arts of diplomacy. It wouldn't play with you or ask you riddles, but it understood all about arrogance and power and cruelty, and if it could possibly manage it, it would burn your head off because it liked to. Which is very different from the way that the swamp dragons are described, because they're described as basically these awful little creatures. And then we also get a description of it flying. So nothing in the world should have been able to fly like that. The wings thumped up and down with a noise like potted thunder, but the dragon moved as though it was idly sculling through the air. If it stopped flapping, the movement suggested it would simply glide to a halt. It floated, not flew. For something the size of a barn with an armor-plated hide, it was a pretty good trick. So we have this, I think it's quite a lovely description of the dragon.
Yeah, I love this description of the dragon. I also liked, and it's the first time I've thought about this, that we're on our third dragon book, so it's sort of funny that it's wait a minute, dragons don't make sense physics wise. The heaviest bird is 8 pounds, and these are tons. These are heavier than an elephant, and then they can fly. So I think that's a fun thing to be wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense, but still it's super cool.
Yeah, and it is something that Vimes specifically is wondering about the whole book. He's like, how does this thing fly? It shouldn't be able to fly. How is it able to do this? He's looking at the really inbred dragon and thinking that thing can't fly and he's tiny. And then he's thinking back to this dragon. He's trying to figure it out. And he does eventually come to the conclusion of it has to be powered by magic, which it is. And he's right. And it's being summoned by magic and also powered by that same magic. And that makes like way more sense than dragons in some of the more serious books that we've read so far.
Yeah, I was we like this is a podcast right now about the canon of dragons, and I thought it was a really interesting addition to the canon.
Oh yeah. So Vimes does get injured in the fall, and they take him to see Lady Ramkin, and she does give one of her properties, which is in the city, to the Night's Watch because theirs was destroyed. While Vimes is still there, an angry mob comes to kill her dragons because they're afraid of dragons, and Vimes chases them away in a nightgown and pink slippers. And he's basically holding one of the dragons like a gun and is kind of cocking it like a gun and shooting fireballs at them. And the dragon doesn't seem like it's having a great time with it, but they don't seem like they think very well. So it is very funny to kind of imagine and picture him cocking this dragon like a gun. I kind of thought that the swamp dragons looked like the way I envisioned them. In How to Train Your Dragons, you know, the little dragons that were kind of more like lizards with wings.
I guess it's been a minute since I watched it, and we haven't read the book
Yeah.
yet.
Their eyes kind of point in different directions, and they're kind of stupid.
Yeah, I
Um,
think that. I think
I
I
think
think I
that's what they
remember what you're
look.
talking about.
I think that's what they look like. That's how I pictured these
I
dragons.
have just kind of been imagining what if you put scales and wings on a pug. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because they remind me a lot of pugs, like something that was sort of bred in a way that you're just like, oh, oops.
Yeah.
So that's sort of what I've been imagining.
So, so as a thanks, no hate on pugs. They just, their noses don't work so well.
It would be better if they could breathe.
Yeah. As a thank you, Ramkin gives Vimes the very inbred dragon, and he takes it back to the Night's Watch new headquarters, where Nobby names it Errol because he has a cousin or something named Errol, and Errol becomes its new name. The librarian is also at the new headquarters, and they make him a citizen deputy of the Watch. While they do this, they then take Errol to try to sniff out the dragon, so they use him as kind of a bloodhound. While they're doing this, though, the dragon appears again, but a man shows up with a shining sword on a horse, stabs at the dragon, and the dragon disappears. And everyone's excited because they think that he killed the dragon, which must mean that he is the king of Ankh-Morpork, come to reclaim his title. But none of this sits well with Vimes because, again, his detective skills are awakening, and he is also, after learning so much about dragon anatomy, he is like, that dragon should have exploded. It should not have just disappeared. There should be dragon guts on literally everything. And he's looking around the plaza, and there's nothing there. And while he's looking around the plaza, Errol is eating literally everything he can find, which is like bricks, broken glass, just pieces of garbage. And the way that this is described is quite funny. While he's doing that, the librarian does something called, he's searching the library and he enters what's called the L space to find out who took the missing book. And the L space is basically because Discworld exists in a multiverse of all realities, including our own. The L space is every library in existence. So basically, it's described as a place between all the libraries, and he can enter into any library or basically anywhere where a lot of books are through the L space. And he goes back into this space, and he goes back in time through this, where he sees who stole the book. He also reads the book while he's there, and then he jumps back into the normal timeline. And you think that this went on a little long?
I just like looking back on it, I was just like, I don't know why this happened other than to show off the L space, but we'll talk about that later.
The L space was quite lovely. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really cool scene, and there's like really great characterization from the librarian, who I don't think we're doing like a great job of discussing his personality because it's kind of subdued, but like he's a great fun character.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just we'll talk about what happens when he comes out and how it really doesn't really matter why he did this at all.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it matters. It seemed more like Terry Pratchett wanted to talk about the L space, which is described in a really cool way. And it is cool. Like there are these monsters that exist there that are all kind of literary monsters. Like you want to watch out for cliches is one of the things that is described. And it also talks about how this is why all secondhand booksellers are kind of weird, which I thought was quite funny as someone who loves secondhand bookstores. But yeah, it doesn't really matter. There is also a joke there where he talks about, but he's thinking about warning his past self about the person stealing the book, and he's like, no, you can't do that because you can't mess with time, because time, and he says specifically time bifurcates like a pair of trousers, which is a bit in Witches Abroad. One of the witches is wearing trousers, and one of the other witches says that she's bifurcated. And I'm wondering if that was just like a reference to this other this other book, or if this is just a phrase.
It's used bifurcated like pants is
Yeah,
used multiple times.
it is, but it's like used literally in Witches Abroad. So I don't know if that's like a reference to Witches Abroad or if it's just a saying, but because I read them both at the same time, I did catch it. And it made me wonder how many of the jokes in this book are references to jokes in other books. So is the L space in another book as well? Because dwarf bread is also mentioned in this book, and it plays a much larger role in Witches Abroad. But anyway, the dragon does appear again in the plaza as Vimes is trying to investigate, and Errol tries to fight it, but has no control when flying, so he can't actually get close to it. But because his flying is so erratic, the dragon can't shoot it with its fire because it keeps missing. And this is when Vimes realizes that dragons use magic to exist. That is where the thefts came from. He realizes that the reason that there are all these magical items being stolen is because someone was using magic to summon the dragon, which is also why it kind of didn't matter that we had that scene with the librarian, because the librarian figures it out because he's able to read the book in the past. But if Vimes just figures it out on his own anyway, we didn't need that. But whatever. He also realizes that the dragon has figured out how to summon its own magic, and it's summoning the magic kind of from the library because the library is a source of magic. The dragon does fly away, and Errol follows it, and they all pursue it. As it's flying, it destroys the secret society's meeting house, where we learn that the secret society was meeting. However, the Grand Master was not present. But all of them, except for one, was killed, who they do take into custody. And when they take him into custody, Vimes is telling Carrot, we cannot molest someone who is arrested. We have to treat them with dignity and care, which does come up later in the book as well. So the coronation is happening pretty much instantaneously, which all of the characters are like, that happened really fast. And it kind of hammers home that someone within the palace is the one who is the Grand Master. And Vimes has to go and sit with the coronation because he's the leader of the Night's Watch, and he orders the rest of them to go up to the roofs to watch for the dragon because he is convinced that the dragon is going to come back.
Yeah, it's not just quick because someone's on the watch. It's also quick because like there hasn't been a monarchy in like 400 years, and then all of a sudden you get a bunch of scenes with people who are like now monarchists like in the town, and it's just like, wait a minute, how are
Yeah.
you such a fervent monarchist? This thing didn't exist a week ago. So it's sort of like a joke on how people switch sides and like
Mhm.
have like very fervent opinions on things they hadn't heard about until like a day ago. There's a lot of
Yeah.
people who are really into the coronation for no reason.
Yeah, which I think might also be a joke about how people are they were so into the royal weddings that were happening, and I don't I mean this was
I
written
mean,
years
Terry
ago.
Pratchett is British, so he's
Yeah.
probably like there are monarchists around him, so he's probably just making fun of those people.
Yeah, but people in America were even so into the royal weddings. It's like
We fought a war on this, guys.
I feel like England was not super excited about the last coronation that happened, but it did feel like a departure of how they usually feel. But anyway, so Vimes is kind of paranoid when he's sitting there, and he does believe that a group of crows is the dragon returning. Wants asks for his badge, and he leaves. And because he leaves, he actually misses the dragon coming and killing the would-be king. As he's home, he notices that Errol has eaten everything in the new meeting house. And throughout the remainder of the book, it cuts back to Errol eating things and kind of instinctually finding the like things that have the chemical properties that he needs to eat and to do something. But as this is happening, the other three do realize that they're standing on top of the dragon. It takes off, it kills the king. Vimes runs back, watches the priest who was going to crown the king hand the dragon the crown, which the dragon takes, realizes that it's only plated with gold and not actual gold. He kills the priest, grabs Wants, and enters the palace. Then the city decides that the dragon makes a fine king, and they still want to celebrate the coronation. And they decide that that counted as a coronation, so they have a new king. Do you want to talk about the people of the city more, or?
Yeah, so like once the dragon moves into the castle and starts just like truly destroying it a little bit,
Mhm.
everyone's just
Yeah.
like, well, I guess we have a dragon king now. Just like more blind acceptance, trying to make it work. And like, yeah, it'll be great for foreign policy is like a conversation that one of them has. Truly absurd, motivated reasoning. And you can just sort of see how the town folk are kind of stupid because like obviously having a dragon is bad, you know, that destroys the town and the people in it and
Yeah.
murders and it's just like hanging out, but they're like, maybe we can
Mhm.
make it work, you know. We're not too different, you and I. It'll be good for certain reasons. So it's a very silly, it shows how silly and like corrupt but also like kind of trying to make it work the town folk are. It's a good scene.
This is also where I think that and so the climax is obviously happening here, and this is where it does start to get really convoluted because Pratchett has to resolve all of these different things that he has set up. So it did feel a little bit like a drag from this point on to get to the end of the book. Again, I think because I read this, like I read probably half the book in one day, just because I had a lot of time. And I think that if I had broken it up, I would have maybe enjoyed it more. So anyway, getting back to the plot, Wance invites the counselors to lunch. And so they enter the palace. The palace is really destroyed. They describe the Great Hall as being made greater because the dragon has blown out all these walls in the palace and it's multiple floors higher than it used to be or the dragon has destroyed multiple floors and it's hanging above them while they're eating. And it does have a hoard, but the hoard is not jewels because Ankh-Morpork does not have a lot of jewels. It's like silverware and gold-plated things. So it's not a very impressive hoard. And Wance is basically trying to talk to the counselors about how they're going to increase the hoard through warfare and all of these things. And then he basically says, well, we're going to need to feed the dragon one maiden each month, which the counselors are like, kind of, what the fuck? But they don't want to say anything because they're terrified of this dragon. And they leave. And then we learned that Wance is actually psychically connected to the dragon. And he and the dragon have this conversation where the dragon talks about meeting the expectations of cruelty that Wance was expecting when he summoned it through eating virgins. So again, it's this trope that is coming to fruition purely because the characters in the book are also aware of the trope. So Vimes goes to confront Wance and is thrown into the dungeon. Here we do have a nice moment, again talking about tropes and heroes, because the palace guard comes to arrest him and Wance is saying like, arrest him, and they're like, but there's only one of him, the guard captain, and he's smiling, said the man behind him, probably going to swing from the chandeliers any minute, said one of his colleagues, and kick over the table, and that. He's not even armed, shrieked Wance. Worst kind, that, said one of the guards, with deep stoicism. They leap up, grab one of the ornamental swords behind the shield over the fireplace. Yeah, said another suspiciously. And then they chuck a chair at you. There's no fireplace. There's no sword. There's only him. Now take him, screamed Wance. So again, these characters are completely aware of these tropes. And it does create a lot of humor in the book, though I'm sure I did not read that anywhere near as well as the narrator of the audiobook does. So.
It's an analysis podcast, not a performance podcast.
Yeah. There we go. So then we cut to the rest of the watch. They decide to try to shoot the dragon in its vulnerable spot because Carrot had heard stories about all dragons having a vulnerable spot. And this, I think, is another scene where the bit goes on a little too long. So Colin has his lucky arrow. They're trying to decide how best to shoot it, and then they're talking about odds. And in this world, luck is a deity. She exists. She isn't really a character in this book, but she is in other books. And they talk about how it has to be exactly 1,000,000 to 1 odds for it to work. So if it's 999, how do you even say this? 9
It doesn't matter. Basically, they are like, if it's a million to one odds, it works every time. But if it's anywhere less, like
or
1,000
more.
to one
Yeah.
odds or 10 to one odds, like that never happens. So they spent like 4 chapters trying to figure out how to make shooting a dragon in a random spot, 1,000,000 to one odds.
Yeah, he's standing on one leg, he's closing his eyes, he's stuffing things into his mouth. It just goes on a little long, and maybe we're talking about it a little too long now. But as they're, pretty much dicking around with that, Lady Ramkin is taken to the dragon because she is the highest born virgin that exists in the city. Before she is taken, she recognizes that Errol is acting really oddly. He has come back to her. He's covered in ice, and she's really not sure what's going on with him. But she's taken to the dragon, and then it cuts away. It cuts back to Vimes in the dungeon, and he meets the patrician who has also been thrown into the dungeon, where he looks very comfortable.
Vimes meets the patrician in the dungeon, and the patrician is shaving in a mirror being held by a tiny mice.
Rat.
A rat, yes, because he is like somehow maybe created like warring factions between the bugs and the mice and the snakes,
And the scorpions, yeah.
so that he now supervises them and like rules over them. And it's just so clear that the only thing he knows how to do is to like manipulate and form social structures, and that he will do it even on a miniature scale.
Yeah, and he also comments that so when they constructed the dungeon, once put snakes and scorpions inside the dungeon, and he was like, that was too much. He doesn't understand excess. And then the scorpions and snakes made problems for the rats, so he advised them. And he keeps making these comments, which are so funny because the rats can't read, so they can only bring him like this motley collection of books. He asks them for food, but they're so tiny that they make him things and they bring him things, but he asks them for like a specific drink and they bring him the wrong drink. And he's apologetic to Vimes because he's like, they can't read. They can't read. You have to understand. They're rats. But he's still commanding them. And then they have this conversation about this dungeon where Vimes says, I would have expected you to have, run away. And the patrician says, you should never trust a leader who has plans to run away when things get bad. You never want to construct a dungeon that you wouldn't want to find yourself in. And he basically points to the door of the dungeon, and Vimes realizes that it's so blockaded that it's actually protecting the patrician against the outside world rather than the other way around. So it would be very difficult for people to actually get in and harm the patrician when he is in the dungeon. Cuts back to the watch, and they try to kill the dragon, but it wasn't 1,000,000 to 1 odds. And Colin misses, and it does destroy the building that they are on. And they all jump into a lake that's behind the building, and that is a 100 or 1,000,000 to 1 odds. And so they all survive it.
Yeah, them surviving getting exploded by a dragon is exactly 1,000,000 to 1 odds, so they end up
Mhm.
making it out. It's just like, well, that wasn't, but this was, so it worked out, and it's like, all right, yeah,
All
sure,
right,
whatever.
yeah.
All right.
Vimes basically is trying to dig a steel rod out of the wall to try to loosen it enough that he can get out. And the patrician is just watching him kind of curiously this whole time, but allowing him to do it. And he's, very intent on breaking out. And the librarian does come and is able to very quickly then help him out of the prison.
Yeah, so Vimes is like almost out there, and then he sees through the hole he's made, the librarian, and the librarian just like rips it apart because he's an orangutan. and just much
Yeah.
stronger, and then frees him, and it's like a fun scene. So they escape from the palace, you assume. I believe, oh yes, there's another great scene of guards being like, stop that there, and then just like, but not trying too hard, and then Vimes gets a good punch in, and then someone, and we didn't talk about this earlier, but if you say the word monkey in front of the orangutan, he loses his mind. So the other guard's like, I don't want to fight monkey, and then the orangutan loses his mind. I think like Hulk from the first Avengers movies to Loki like smashes this guard into the floor.
Yeah.
It's a good scene.
It is a good scene.
It's one of the few scenes where there's actually action happening on the screen.
And I think the monkey I would have gotten attacked too. I think
Oh,
the orangutan also is able to communicate to Vimes that something is going to happen at noon, which is quickly approaching, and that's when Lady Ramkin is going to be sacrificed to the dragon.
Vimes and the librarian have a very Han Solo and Chewie where
Oh, totally.
the orangutan is like ook ook ook, and Vimes is like, you don't say gosh, and you're like, all right, I get it. It's a
Yeah.
good bit.
It's cute. So he runs out. Errol is able to finish the transformation of his guts, and he lifts off like a little rocket, basically farting flame, and goes to fight the dragon. And he's moving so fast that the dragon cannot hit him with its flame, even though its flame is very precise and very hot. And while this fight is happening, Vimes is trying to cut Lady Ramkin off of the pillar that she's stuck to. And she's kind of just commenting on this fight, like, oh, well, like, if the dragon hits Errol once, he's done because Errol's flame still isn't hot enough to really harm the dragon. And then Errol, like, zooms away. He comes back. And the way this is described is pretty funny because he's, like, going so fast that he's tearing up farm field as he passes it. And, so ridiculous. And he basically breaks the sound barrier. He's moving so fast with this little fart rocket out of his butt, and he, knocks down the female dragon and causes a bunch of debris to fall on her. And then he flies away again. And Lady Ramkin's like, well, that was weird because they usually fight until one of them explodes. And then everyone's coming around to try to kill the dragon. Carrot then attempts to arrest the dragon. And then he's having to protect the arrested dragon from the people who are trying to kill it. And one of the other guards does say something like, this will be the first democratically killed dragon, which was I like that line a lot. But he's trying to ward off all these people who are trying to kill the dragon because it was arrested, it can't be harmed. And then Errol does come back. They realize the dragon slowly lifts away from the debris, and Errol and the dragon fly away together. And then Lady Ramkin realizes that the dragon was actually female, and Errol was trying to impress it. And she accepted his advances, and so they are now a mated pair, I guess. So, kind of a weird scene, but
Great dragon book ends with like there's we haven't had a dragon book, I don't think, where the dragons, get dirty with it. It's a funny thing. Or implied.
There weren't.
Oh,
I
I
don't
guess
think
no,
there was
I'm
dragon
totally
breeding in
wrong.
Earthsea. Yeah,
There was baby dragons in it, but no.
yeah, there are
Okay.
baby dragons. Well, maybe it will be interesting to keep a tally of how many books have dragon mating practices in them, because I wasn't expecting that in this book, and I was pretty surprised when it happened.
Yeah, so far they've all had some sort of mating practices, but not necessarily always literal breeding.
Yeah. So, we cut back to the patrician who breaks out of the prison by pulling a brick out of the wall, and behind the brick is a key to the prison door and a bunch of other supplies. And basically, he starts stalking Wance through this destroyed palace. Wance threatens him with a sword. The watch is able to show up, and Vimes is able to block his thrust of a sword with Carrot's sword, breaking the sword and leaving Wance basically defenseless. Vimes tells Carrot to throw the book at Wance, which we all know means arrest him. But again, Carrot was raised by dwarves and they don't understand turns of phrases, so Carrot literally throws the law book at Wance because all of the floors were destroyed by the dragon, there is a huge hole in the floor in the room that they're in, and Wance is basically pushed by the force of the book, pushed off of the platform and falls to his death. The librarian then takes the dragon book back from Wance's body. He shows a passage of the book, the dragon book, to Vimes, which basically tells him that the kind of dragon you summon is, whether it's evil or cruel or good or bad, is based on basically the heart of the individual who summons it and the intention. So the dragon that Wance summoned was always going to be cruel and evil because Wance was a very nefarious person.
Yeah, in the beginning, they talk about dragons existing and then going away and not knowing where they went. And this book basically is like dragons went into our imagination. And that's why when they summoned him, the dragon, or summoned her, I guess, the dragon was a part of Wance's imagination. And that's why it was like so stereotypical and kind of shitty.
Mm-hmm. And I think that also, again, I've said this like maybe 20 times, it plays into the trope because Wance was expecting the dragon to want to eat a maiden. It was expecting it to be cruel. He was expecting it to fight the king, which that did, come back and fight the king and kill it. All of these things did happen.
That's why I wanted gold, all that sort of stuff, which is
Yeah, I wanted gold.
true, but then also like the dragon decided to leave with the other dragon, which like doesn't super work with that. But like I said,
I think that part of it was the dragon, because the dragon was slowly trying to. So Wance was completely in control of it when he was summoning it actively, and the dragon was pissed. So when we did get little flashes into the dragon's perspective when it was being summoned, it was really angry about being summoned. It didn't want to be. It wanted to be somewhere else, and then it was suddenly being summoned and controlled. So when it came back of its own accord, it was able to power itself by magic that it found, and then it was kind of controlling Wance. So the role was reversed, where it was able, because of that psychic connection, it was able to use Wants to discuss these things and make demands instead of the other way around. So perhaps it going off with Errol was it fully breaking away from that control and that expectation.
what a girl boss. The dragon broke away from its expectations so it could go live with its short king. What an inspirational story.
So the book is basically in the end now. The patrician gives their watch a raise. Carrot decides to start courting. Vimes gets together with Lady Ramkin. There's this really cute scene where she invites him to dinner and he thinks, well, she couldn't do worse than me, but I couldn't do better than her, which was really quite sweet.
A really cute couple throughout.
They were really cute. I loved them together. It was sweet.
We don't talk about it much because it's like
No.
not super a focus. But there's this great scene of like her thinking that Vimes is at the door and like trying to get ready in like kind of a like haphazard monstrous sort of way because she's like a larger person.
And she smells like dragons, which stink. So she's like putting on this perfume to try to mask the smell, and it just doesn't work.
But they're very cute.
Yeah. So the book ends with Carrot getting a drink with the others, and they discuss his crown-shaped birthmark and his sword, and he's like, well, that doesn't mean anything. I'm not a king. I think kings are stupid. And Colin kind of realizes, like, oh, but doesn't say anything. And then the last scene of the book is Errol and his dragon girlfriend flying off of the Discworld and into space. And that's how the book ends.
Yeah, that is how the book ends. We didn't talk about the patrician doing a villain monologue, but I'm not a huge fan of monologues, so I guess you'll have to read the book to find out what he says.
I don't even remember that.
It's sort of like, this is the way the world works. Everyone is evil and sucks.
I remember that now.
It's a little heavy-handed.
I mean, he has to. It's a book about tropes. He has to have a villain monologue.
Gotta have him. I mean, he's not the villain. It's supposed to be like a realist monologue, but
Yeah.
it's a very grim, dark, or it's a very particular view of people that I'm not sure I agree with, but is like very perfect for this world. But you'll have to read the book to find out what it's about.
So I do hope that summary made sense. There was a ton of stuff packed into this book, and we did skip a lot of scenes that weren't absolutely relevant, but some of them were very funny and very great. I would absolutely recommend reading this book. I would also recommend reading Witches Abroad, which I don't think is the first in the Witches series, but I loved it. So I know we didn't talk about that today, but
Our
hopefully
first
stay tuned.
non-dragon recommendation.
Yeah, it was so good. Is there anything else you would like to discuss?
About the book? No, I think
Mhm.
do we wanna talk about tropes, humor, or do you wanna just talk about dragons first?
I think we talk about the tropes, and I do think we talk about the humor a lot. So I think that we can just talk about the dragons.
So, this is probably our first book with 2 different types of dragons?
Well, there's technically that other type of dragon in Earthsea, but it is said that it's not really a dragon, it just looks like a dragon.
Yeah, I think it's a very similar thing where you have just, like, a big lizard, and
Yeah.
the swamp dragons are sort of like I sort of took them originally as, like they kind of seem like species cousin, like the more traditional dragons in this book learn to consume magic, and so they stop being, like, weird little swamp dwellers that could, like, not really fly, but could actually really fly and get bigger and stronger and
Mhm.
tougher. And then the swamp dragons are sort of like the people who didn't figure it out, and they're just like they're able to do everything a dragon does but worse because they have to contend with actual physics.
Yeah, they also kind of remind me of because they're kept as pets, so there's the Sunshine I think it's called the Sunshine Society,
Mhm.
which is the dragon rescue because they get too big and then people don't want them, which I think is kind of supposed to be a joke on alligators, and alligators do exist in Ankh-Morpork. One of the characters actually gets eaten by an alligator, one of the Elucidated Brotherhood. But they also kind of remind me of, like, when people they wanna have a big exotic cat, but they don't have the space for, like, a lion or a tiger, so they get a serval instead, and it's still, like, a terrible pet. You shouldn't keep one of those as a pet, and they stink, and they are not tame or domesticated at all, so they, are kind of still dangerous to keep as a pet, but people want them because they are, unique and exciting.
Yeah, and only the rich can actually raise them.
Yeah, or someone gets, like, a lemur and they traffic it into the country because they just want a lemur. It's like, you shouldn't they also stink, and they would make a terrible pet. Don't for those of you listening, you don't want a pet lemur. I actually knew someone who had a friend who had a lemur that was confiscated from him. It was
Wow.
bad, yeah. Anyway, but yeah, they're kind of I think the swamp dragons are 2 dragons as a smaller wildcat is to a lion or tiger, like maybe a lynx or a bobcat too would fall into that category. Anyway, I went on a long for a long time about sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. No, it's just I think it's very interesting with a story that is a lot of tropes. Like I think a lot about what's Lady Ramkins. So like Lady Ramkin is like very clearly a subversion of like a princess in distress, but is
Mhm.
also then used in like serves the role of like princess or damsel in distress in the role. And I think it's really interesting in the way that they handle dragons is they have both the subversion of what a dragon is, where you have these like weird little farty, smelly, like chemically complex like lizard dragons, and then you have literally a magically created platonic ideal of a dragon.
Mhm.
It is the way that they handle dragons in this book is like so indicative, less of like well actually it's indicative completely of like the canon that we've seen set forth in our previous books and like
Yeah.
also in mythology, and then also subverts it in a
Mhm.
really interesting way. And it's like a way the way dragons are used in the book is like very much in service of the larger narrative and understanding of like what the book is trying to say.
Mhm. Yeah, I love the way that the dragons were portrayed in this book, and I do think that there are a lot of references not that there are references to the other 2 books that we've read so far, but there are references to that kind of dragon and that trope of that dragon, and I'm excited to see hopefully in future books, we will have more examples of the weird little swamp dragons and things like that as well. Yeah, we I feel like we did cheat a little bit with Earthsea unintentionally because there was only a dragon in that one scene. But I think we did make up for it in this book, which was all about the dragons and people trying to negotiate or fight or live with or live underneath dragons.
It's very interesting because I feel like there's two types of dragons that we've seen in Earthsea and in Dragon Riders, which is sort of why we picked them and set them up. Where in Earthsea you have sort of the more mythical, like maybe not medieval, but like, definitely European style dragon,
Mhm.
where, they breathe fire and they've got scales and they like hoard gold and they live in castles. And then in Dragon Riders of Pern, you have the more like companion dragon. I call it the horse girl dragon, but because it's like you have a dragon and its rider that has to take care of it, and there's a bond, and you sort of get both of them
Mhm.
in this book. Also, with like literally, Lady Ramkin is like kind of a horse girl, dragon girl. She's an embodiment of someone who would be attracted to that trope and that bases their life around it,
Mhm.
even if it's like sort of a subversion of that because these dragons are not like horses. They're more like weird little dogs. But it's just like a really is I really enjoy the dragons in this book and like what it says about the larger canon and how it sort of exists in it and apart from it.
Yeah, I agree. So, do you think you will read the other books in this series?
I think I would listen to these other books in the series.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, or it would be a very good book to like read before bed, something I could pick up and put down. I
Mhm.
I think the teaser for last episode was like, will I find out that I like Terry Pratchett or not? And I think I feel very vindicated in the books that I put down. Because I do think like while he's a very talented writer, he's like it's very much a tone and a direction of storytelling and engaging with the audience that like I found particularly grating, and I understand why. And I think that after reading him, I think he's a very talented and like a genius, which like obviously people have been saying for years. And like I specifically just kind of bounce off of his books, but I think I would definitely be interested because I think he's so talented and interesting and like maybe trying to engage in a different way. And I do think that audiobooks is probably a way to like kind of take such an intense focus off of it that I can like enjoy the levity of it.
Yeah, like I said before, this book was kind of his books do kind of feel like a play. You're reading a play, and when you're reading a play, if you haven't read a play instead of just watched it, you have to really do a lot of mental work to kind of figure out how the words are supposed to be delivered, how the lines are supposed to be delivered. And because the humor in his book is so intense and basically all consuming, you do have to do some work when you're just reading it with your eyes to decide like how best is this line to be delivered, which is not a problem. I didn't have a problem with it, but when listening to the other book, and I think I wouldn't have even thought of this if I wasn't listening to them at the same time and not having to do that work of how the lines were delivered, they were just delivered. And audiobook narrators, it's a production. They're professionals in their field. They know how to do this. This is what their job is. It's not just someone reading a book in a sound booth. Especially, I think, with Terry Pratchett's audiobooks, because they're multiple people. So they have someone reading the footnotes and a different person reading the main story. And then they have someone else reading Death's lines because of the way that Death's lines are written. It would be unclear that it was Death speaking if it wasn't narrated by a different person. So this is actually a kind of an audio production when you're reading the audiobooks. And I think that that might be the best way to enjoy these books. And again, I'm just astonished that this hasn't been made into a TV series. It would be fantastic. But I do think that it would have been more digestible to read large portions of it also as an audiobook. Again, because I listened to the whole thing in a day when I was driving. So if you do have something mindless to do, like a long drive, or you have to paint a wall or lawn work or something like that,
Or you
this
have to walk your dog. Like the 20 minutes I listened to, I was walking my dog. So I was like, oh, I get it now. This is better.
or maybe even just like exercising, it made it so much more enjoyable to do that long ride because the laughs per minute is pretty high. I was actively laughing out loud when I was reading both of the books, which I haven't done in so long. I might have like one little chuckle in a book, but I was laughing out loud multiple times when reading both of these books. So yeah, I think you should all read these books. I think they were great, especially if you like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This is definitely, it feels like that, the fantasy version of that. So that was Guards by Terry Pratchett.
What are we reading next?
We are reading Blue Moon Rising by Simon R. Green. This is a book that I actually didn't even know about until I was researching dragon books for this podcast. And it seems like it's another comedy, so it might be a little bit daring to read it after a Terry Pratchett book, since Terry Pratchett is kind of king of comedy. And based on my understanding of the premise, it follows the spare heir to the throne who is sent off to kill a dragon, but when he finds the dragon, he befriends it instead. So afterwards, shenanigans ensues. And apparently he has a pet talking unicorn, which I'm also pretty excited about, this pet talking unicorn. So we'll see how it compares to Guards, and we'll see how the dragon is portrayed in Blue Moon Rising.
Very excited. So that's all we have today. Thanks for listening. If you like this, please hit the subscribe button, leave a comment, send us an email, or tell us what dragon books you want us to read next. Bye.